The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the small outpost in Afghanistan's Helmand province. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez wiped the sweat from her brow as she checked her rifle for the third time that morning. At 28 years old, she had already served 3 tours in combat zones, but something felt different about this mission. The intelligence reports had been vague, mentioning increased enemy activity in the region, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary for their elite special operations unit. Maria was the only female soldier in Alpha Team, a distinction that had earned her both respect and skepticism from her peers. She had proven herself countless times in training and combat, outperforming many of her male counterparts in marksmanship and tactical awareness. Her Mexican-American heritage had instilled in her a fierce determination to succeed against all odds, a trait that would soon be put to the ultimate test. The morning briefing had been routine. Their mission was to secure a strategic hilltop position overlooking a suspected Taliban supply route. Intelligence suggested that enemy forces were using the valley below to transport weapons and personnel between their strongholds. Alpha Team's job was to establish an observation post and report on enemy movements while remaining undetected. The team consisted of 12 highly trained soldiers, including 2 Navy SEAL snipers who had been attached to their unit for this particular operation. Petty Officer Jake Morrison and Chief Petty Officer Ryan Walsh were legends in their own right, each with over 50 confirmed kills between them. Their presence on the mission was meant to provide the team with unparalleled long-range precision firepower. As they prepared their equipment, Maria noticed the nervous energy that always preceded a dangerous mission. The soldiers checked their weapons, communication devices, and survival gear with practiced efficiency. Each man carried specialized equipment suited to his role in the operation. The SEAL snipers had their custom-modified rifles with high-powered scopes, while the rest of the team carried standard assault rifles and support weapons. The helicopter insertion went smoothly in the pre-dawn darkness. The team was dropped 3 kilometers from their target position to avoid detection. They moved through the rocky terrain in single file, using night vision goggles to navigate the treacherous landscape. Maria took her position in the middle of the formation, her senses alert to any sign of danger. The hilltop position offered an excellent view of the valley below, just as the intelligence reports had indicated. The team quickly established their observation post, setting up camouflaged positions that would allow them to monitor the area without being seen. The SEAL snipers positioned themselves at the highest point, their rifles trained on the valley floor nearly 800 meters below. For the first few hours, everything seemed normal. They observed local civilians moving through the valley, farmers tending to their fields, and children playing near a small village. But as the day wore on, Maria began to notice subtle changes in the patterns of movement below. Groups of military-aged men were gathering in unusual numbers, and vehicles were arriving at the village more frequently than seemed normal. Through her binoculars, Maria watched as more and more armed figures appeared in the valley. What had initially looked like a peaceful farming community was revealing itself to be something far more sinister. She reported her observations to the team leader, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Thompson, who immediately contacted their base to request guidance. The response from headquarters was concerning. Satellite imagery was showing massive enemy troop movements converging on their location from multiple directions. What had been planned as a routine observation mission was rapidly developing into something much more dangerous. The enemy forces weren't just using the valley as a supply route, they were preparing for a major offensive operation. As the afternoon progressed, the situation continued to deteriorate. Radio intercepts indicated that the Taliban forces had somehow learned of the American presence on the hilltop. Whether through local informants or their own surveillance, the enemy knew exactly where Alpha Team was positioned. The element of surprise had been completely lost. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson made the difficult decision to call for immediate extraction. However, when he attempted to contact their helicopter support, he was met with devastating news. A major enemy offensive had begun across the entire region, and all available aircraft were being used to support other units that were already under heavy attack. Alpha Team would have to hold their position until air support became available. The first enemy scouts appeared on the ridgeline to their north just as the sun began to set. Maria spotted them through her scope, 3 figures moving carefully from rock to rock, obviously trying to determine the exact location of the American position. She whispered the information to Morrison, who adjusted his sniper rifle to track the closest target. The SEAL sniper's first shot rang out across the valley, and one of the enemy scouts dropped immediately. But instead of retreating, the remaining scouts began signaling to unseen forces below. Within minutes, muzzle flashes could be seen throughout the valley as dozens of enemy fighters began moving up the hillside toward their position. What followed was unlike anything Maria had experienced in her previous deployments. Wave after wave of Taliban fighters emerged from concealment throughout the valley. Far more than intelligence had suggested were operating in the area. It became clear that Alpha Team had stumbled into a major enemy stronghold, not a simple supply route. The two SEAL snipers worked frantically to thin out the advancing enemy forces. Their precision shooting was incredible to watch, each shot finding its target with deadly accuracy. But for every enemy fighter they eliminated, two more seemed to take his place. The volume of return fire was increasing exponentially, and their position was becoming more precarious by the minute. As darkness fell, the enemy forces began coordinating their attack more effectively. They had surrounded the hilltop position and were advancing from multiple directions simultaneously. Rocket-propelled grenades began impacting near their position, sending showers of rock and debris over the defenders. It was becoming clear that their situation was rapidly becoming desperate. Maria checked her ammunition supply and realized that at the current rate of fire, they would be running low on bullets within a few hours. The enemy seemed to have unlimited reinforcements, while Alpha Team was completely cut off from resupply or support. She looked around at her teammates and saw the same grim realization reflected in their faces. They were facing overwhelming odds with no hope of rescue anytime soon. The night brought no relief for Alpha Team. If anything, the situation grew worse as the enemy forces used the darkness to move closer to their defensive positions. The Taliban fighters had learned from their initial losses during the daylight assault and were now employing more sophisticated tactics. They moved in small groups using cover and concealment to advance up the hillside, while maintaining coordinated fire on the American position. Maria found herself positioned between the two SEAL snipers, providing security for their flanks while they continued their deadly work. Morrison and Walsh had been shooting continuously for over 6 hours, and the strain was beginning to show. Even the most elite soldiers had limits, and theirs were being tested to the breaking point. Their shooting remained accurate, but the sheer volume of targets was overwhelming their ability to respond effectively. The enemy had brought heavy weapons into the fight. Machine gun positions had been established at various points around the valley, creating overlapping fields of fire that made any movement extremely dangerous for the trapped Americans. Mortar rounds began falling near their position with increasing accuracy, indicating that the enemy was adjusting their fire based on careful observation of the defensive positions. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson crawled from position to position, checking on his soldiers and trying to maintain communication with headquarters. The news from base was not encouraging. The regional offensive had intensified, with American forces under attack at multiple locations throughout the province. Priority for air support was being given to units that were protecting larger installations and civilian populations. As the hours passed, the psychological pressure began to mount. The constant sound of incoming fire, the explosions of mortar rounds, and the screams of enemy fighters created an atmosphere of intense stress. Some of the younger soldiers were showing signs of combat fatigue, their hands shaking as they tried to return accurate fire against targets they could barely see in the darkness. Maria noticed that the enemy was gradually tightening their circle around the hilltop position. What had started as a loose containment was becoming a well-coordinated siege. The Taliban commanders were clearly experienced in this type of warfare, and they understood that time was on their side. They could afford to be patient while the Americans exhausted their ammunition and energy. The first casualty came just after midnight. Specialist Rodriguez was struck by sniper fire while trying to move between positions. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the rocks. Maria immediately crawled to his position under heavy fire, dragging him to safety behind a large boulder. The wound was serious but not life-threatening, though it effectively removed him from the fight. Morrison's rifle jammed during a crucial moment when a group of enemy fighters was advancing on their eastern flank. The SEAL sniper worked frantically to clear the malfunction, while Maria provided covering fire with her assault rifle. She managed to drive back the attackers, but the incident highlighted how precarious their situation had become. Equipment failures at this point could prove catastrophic. The enemy began using psychological warfare tactics as well. They would shout taunts and threats in broken English, trying to demoralize the trapped Americans. Some of the Taliban fighters had megaphones and would broadcast propaganda messages, describing in graphic detail what they planned to do to any survivors they captured. The intent was clear. They wanted to break the Americans' will to fight. But Alpha Team was composed of professional soldiers who had trained for exactly this type of situation. They maintained their discipline and continued to fight with determination despite the overwhelming odds. Maria found herself thinking about her family back home in Texas, using memories of her younger brother and aging parents as motivation to keep fighting. She had promised them she would come home safely, and she intended to keep that promise. As dawn approached, the tactical situation became increasingly desperate. The enemy had managed to establish positions less than 100 meters from the American defensive perimeter. At such close range, the advantage of the SEAL snipers' precision shooting was largely negated. The battle was becoming a close-quarters firefight where volume of fire mattered more than accuracy. Walsh, the more experienced of the two SEAL snipers, took a bullet through his left arm while engaging targets on the southern approach. The wound was bleeding heavily and he was having difficulty operating his rifle effectively. Morrison tried to compensate by shifting his field of fire to cover Walsh's sector, but this left other approaches less well defended. The ammunition situation was becoming critical. Most of the soldiers were down to their last few magazines and there was no possibility of resupply. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson made the difficult decision to implement strict fire discipline, ordering his men to engage only high-priority targets and to make every shot count. This tactical change reduced their defensive firepower at precisely the moment when the enemy was pressing their attack most aggressively. Maria counted her remaining magazines and realized she had enough ammunition for perhaps 30 more minutes of sustained fighting. Around her, she could see her teammates conducting the same grim calculation. The mathematics of warfare were working. Against them, they simply did not have enough bullets to hold off the attacking force indefinitely. The enemy seemed to sense that the Americans were running low on ammunition. Their attacks became more aggressive and coordinated. Groups of fighters would rush the defensive positions while others provided covering fire, forcing the Americans to expend precious rounds repelling each assault. It was a calculated strategy designed to exhaust their resources. Just as the situation seemed hopeless, Morrison made an announcement that surprised everyone. His precision rifle had developed a critical malfunction that he could not repair under combat conditions. The weapon that had accounted for dozens of enemy casualties was now useless. Without hesitation, Walsh attempted to continue the long-range engagement despite his wounded arm, but his accuracy was severely compromised by the injury. For the first time since the battle began, the enemy forces sensed weakness in the American position. They launched a coordinated assault from 3 directions simultaneously, with dozens of fighters advancing under cover of heavy suppressive fire. The Taliban had committed their reserve forces to this final push, clearly believing that they could overwhelm the weakened American defense. The sound of enemy fighters shouting Allahu Akbar filled the air as they charged up the hillside. Maria could see muzzle flashes getting closer and closer to their defensive positions. Some of the enemy fighters had gotten within 50 meters before being stopped by accurate fire from the remaining American weapons. In this moment of supreme crisis, with both SEAL snipers effectively out of action and ammunition running critically low, Maria realized that conventional tactics were no longer sufficient. The situation called for something extraordinary, something that would require her to draw upon every skill she had learned during years of intensive training. The survival of her entire team might depend on her ability to adapt to circumstances that no training manual had ever anticipated. The moment of truth arrived as the enemy's coordinated assault reached its peak intensity. Maria watched through her rifle scope as Taliban fighters advanced on their position from multiple directions. Their victory, seemingly inevitable. The 2 elite SEAL snipers who had been the backbone of their defense were now unable to contribute meaningfully to the fight. Morrison was desperately trying to repair his jammed rifle while Walsh struggled to maintain accuracy with his wounded arm. Lieutenant Colonel, Thompson's voice crackled over the radio as he attempted one final communication with headquarters. The response was heartbreaking. No air support would be available for at least 4 hours, and ground reinforcements were even further away. Alpha Team was truly on their own, facing odds that no military unit should be expected to survive. In this critical moment, Maria made a decision that would define not only her own fate, but the survival of her entire team. She had noticed something during the long night of fighting that the others had missed. The enemy's assault pattern followed predictable routes up the hillside, channeled by the natural terrain features. More importantly, their commanders were positioning themselves at specific locations where they could observe and direct the attacks. Maria realized that the key to survival lay not in continuing the defensive battle they were losing, but in disrupting the enemy's command and control structure. If she could eliminate the leaders coordinating the assault, the attacking forces might lose their cohesion and effectiveness. It was an incredibly dangerous plan that would require her to leave the relative safety of their defensive position and move through enemy-controlled terrain. She quickly explained her strategy to Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, who initially rejected the idea as too risky. But as another wave of enemy fighters advanced to within 30 meters of their position, he realized they had no other options. The conventional defense was failing, and desperate situations called for desperate measures. With heavy reluctance, he gave Maria permission to attempt her audacious plan. Maria gathered specific equipment for her solo mission. She took her assault rifle with 4 remaining magazines, a pistol as backup, several fragmentation grenades, and a pair of night vision goggles that would give her an advantage in the pre-dawn darkness. Most importantly, she studied the terrain carefully, identifying the route she would use to approach the enemy command positions. The plan required her to move down the hillside and circle around to approach the enemy leaders from an unexpected direction. It would take her directly through areas controlled by Taliban fighters, requiring absolute stealth and precision. A single mistake would not only result in her death, but would also eliminate any chance of disrupting the enemy assault before it overwhelmed her teammates. Before beginning her dangerous mission, Maria took a moment to speak privately with each of her wounded comrades. She promised Rodriguez and Walsh that she would get them home safely, though privately she wondered if she would be able to keep that promise. The odds against success were overwhelming, but someone had to try something different before their position was completely overrun. As she prepared to leave the defensive perimeter, Maria felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. All her years of training had prepared her for this moment. The countless hours on the shooting range, the tactical exercises, the physical conditioning, and the mental preparation. Everything she had learned would be put to the test in the next few hours. The first part of her journey took her down the reverse slope of the hill, away from the main enemy force. She moved carefully from rock to rock, using the natural terrain to mask her movement. The sounds of battle continued behind her as her teammates maintained their defensive fire, trying to give the impression that their capabilities remained unchanged. Maria had identified 3 key enemy positions during her observations. The primary command post was located in a cluster of rocks about 400 meters from the American position. A secondary command post was situated near the village where additional reinforcements were being staged. The third target was a heavy machine gun position that had been particularly effective in suppressing American defensive fire. Reaching the first objective required her to cross open ground where she would be exposed to enemy observation. She waited for a period of intense firing that would mask any sound of her movement, then sprinted across the danger area in short bounds. Her heart pounded as she dove behind cover, expecting at any moment to hear shouts of discovery or the crack of bullets passing overhead. The first enemy command post was more sophisticated than she had expected. The Taliban commanders had established a well-organized position with communication equipment, maps, and a clear view of the American defensive positions. 3 officers were huddled around a radio, apparently coordinating with other units in the ongoing assault. Maria studied the position for several minutes, planning her approach carefully. She would have only one chance to eliminate all 3 commanders before they could alert their forces to her presence. The attack would have to be swift, silent, and absolutely decisive. Any mistake would compromise not only this part of her mission but also her ability to reach the other target locations. She approached the command post from an angle that kept her hidden behind a large rock formation. The enemy officers were focused entirely on their radio communications and the battle raging on the hilltop above. Their confidence in their overwhelming numerical advantage had made them careless about security around their own positions. The assault began with a single fragmentation grenade thrown with precision into the center of the command post. The explosion eliminated all 3 officers instantly, while also destroying their communication equipment. Before any nearby fighters could react to the explosion, Maria was already moving toward her second objective, using the confusion to mask her approach. The heavy machine gun position was her next target. This weapon had been causing significant problems for her teammates throughout the night, forcing them to keep their heads down when they needed to be returning effective fire. Eliminating this threat would immediately improve the tactical situation for the defenders on the hilltop. 2 enemy fighters were operating the machine gun while a third served as a spotter and ammunition bearer. They were positioned in a natural depression that provided excellent cover from fire coming from the American position, but left them vulnerable to attack from the flank. Maria approached their position using a dry creek bed that provided concealment from observation. The attack on the machine gun position demonstrated Maria's exceptional marksmanship skills. 3 precisely aimed shots eliminated all 3 enemy fighters before they could react or call for help. She quickly disabled the weapon itself by removing critical components, ensuring it could not be used even if other fighters discovered the position. Her success at the first 2 objectives had taken nearly an hour, and dawn was beginning to break over the valley. The improved visibility would make the remainder of her mission significantly more dangerous, but it would also allow her to move more quickly and engage targets at longer ranges. She still had to reach the main enemy staging area near the village, where the largest concentration of Taliban forces was located. As she moved toward the 3rd objective, Maria could hear that the intensity of fire directed at her teammates had decreased noticeably. The elimination of the command post and heavy machine gun was already having an impact on the enemy's ability to coordinate their assault. But she knew this advantage would be temporary unless she could strike at the heart of their operations. The approach to the village required Maria to traverse the most dangerous part of her mission. Unlike the rocky hillside terrain that had provided natural concealment, the area around the village was relatively flat and open. Taliban fighters were positioned throughout the settlement, and any movement during daylight hours would be extremely risky. But she could hear increased radio chatter and vehicle movement that indicated the enemy was preparing for a final massive assault. Maria found an observation position in an abandoned irrigation ditch, about 200 meters from the village. Through her rifle scope, she could see the true scale of the enemy force for the first time. There were far more fighters present than anyone had imagined, easily over 200 Taliban soldiers armed with assault rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and mortars. The intelligence failure that had led to this situation was complete and catastrophic. The main enemy command center was located in the village mosque, a building that normally would have been off-limits for military operations. But the Taliban commanders had clearly decided that their tactical advantage outweighed any religious considerations. Through the windows of the building, Maria could see officers studying maps and coordinating with multiple radio operators. This was the nerve center of the entire operation. Surrounding the mosque were staging areas where groups of fighters were receiving final briefings before moving out to assault positions. Maria counted at least 6 separate units being organized for what appeared to be a coordinated attack from all directions simultaneously. If this assault succeeded, her teammates would be completely overwhelmed within minutes. The tactical challenge was enormous. The target was heavily defended and located in the center of the enemy's main concentration of forces. Any direct attack would result in immediate retaliation from dozens of nearby fighters. But Maria realized that the enemy's confidence had led to a critical vulnerability. They had positioned large quantities of ammunition and weapons in centralized locations that could be exploited. She identified several key targets that could create maximum disruption with minimum exposure. 2 trucks loaded with ammunition and explosives were parked near the mosque. A mortar position was set up in the village square with a substantial supply of shells. Most importantly, a fuel depot had been established next to the main command center, probably to support the vehicles being used in the operation. Maria's plan was audacious in its simplicity. She would use her remaining grenades and accurate rifle fire to trigger secondary explosions that would destroy the enemy's supplies and disrupt their command structure. The key was timing. She would need to create maximum chaos in minimum time before the enemy could respond effectively to her presence. The attack began with a precisely aimed shot at one of the ammunition trucks. The bullet struck a box of grenades, causing a chain reaction that destroyed both vehicles in a massive explosion. The blast was so powerful that windows shattered throughout the village, and the shock wave knocked several enemy fighters to the ground. Before the enemy could recover from the first explosion, Maria put a bullet into a fuel barrel at the depot. The resulting fireball engulfed the entire area around the mosque, forcing the command staff to evacuate their positions. In the confusion, she managed to eliminate 3 more enemy officers with accurate rifle fire as they fled the burning building. The mortar position was her next target. A fragmentation grenade thrown with perfect accuracy landed directly among the stored shells, creating another spectacular explosion that eliminated the crew and destroyed their weapon. The blast sent debris flying throughout the village square, adding to the chaos and confusion. By this time, the enemy forces had begun to realize they were under attack from an unexpected direction. Groups of fighters were moving to search for the source of the accurate fire that was systematically destroying their capabilities. Maria knew she had perhaps minutes before her position would be discovered, and she would face overwhelming retaliation. She used those precious minutes to engage individual targets of opportunity. Enemy officers trying to reorganize their forces found themselves under deadly accurate sniper fire. Communications personnel attempting to re-establish contact with their assault units were eliminated before they could complete their missions. Every shot was carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. The psychological impact on the enemy forces was as significant as the physical destruction. The Taliban fighters had been confident of victory just minutes before, but now they found themselves under attack from an unknown threat that seemed to be everywhere at once. Units that had been preparing to assault the American position were being recalled to defend the village against the mysterious attacker. Maria's ammunition was running critically low, but she had one more objective to accomplish. The senior enemy commander, identifiable by his distinctive uniform and the deference shown to him by other officers, had established a new command post in a building at the far end of the village. Eliminating him would complete the disruption of the enemy's leadership structure. The shot was the most challenging of her military career. The target was over 300 meters away, partially concealed behind cover and surrounded by bodyguards. Wind conditions were variable, and she would have only one opportunity before her position was certainly discovered. Maria took several deep breaths, allowed her heart rate to slow, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet found its mark with lethal precision. The enemy commander fell immediately, and his bodyguards scattered in confusion, unsure where the shot had come from. The remaining Taliban officers began arguing among themselves about what to do next, their command structure completely disrupted by the systematic elimination of their leadership. But Maria's position had finally been compromised. Enemy fighters had spotted her muzzle flash and were moving to surround her location. She found herself facing the same situation her teammates had been in hours earlier, outnumbered, outgunned, and with limited ammunition. The difference was that she was alone and had no support from friendly forces. The creek bed that had provided concealment during her approach now became a trap as enemy fighters moved to block both ends. Maria realized she would have to abandon stealth and rely on speed and aggressive action to fight her way back to friendly lines. With only one magazine remaining for her rifle and a few rounds in her pistol, every shot would have to count. The running firefight that followed tested every aspect of her training and physical conditioning. She bounded from cover to cover while enemy bullets cracked overhead, pausing only long enough to engage targets that posed immediate threats. Her marksmanship remained deadly accurate even under extreme stress, but the odds were becoming increasingly desperate. As she fought her way back toward the hilltop position, Maria could hear that the intensity of fire directed at her teammates had decreased dramatically. Her mission was succeeding. The enemy assault had been disrupted and their forces were in disarray. But she still had to survive long enough to rejoin her unit and help consolidate their defensive position. The final stretch of her journey would be the most dangerous. She would have to cross open ground while under fire from multiple directions, with virtually no ammunition remaining. Everything would depend on speed, determination, and perhaps a little luck. The dash back to friendly lines became the longest 400 meters of Maria's life. Behind her, the village was in complete chaos as Taliban fighters searched frantically for the sniper, who had decimated their command structure. Fires burned throughout the settlement from the explosions she had triggered, and thick black smoke billowed across the valley, providing some concealment for her desperate retreat. Enemy fighters were pursuing her from multiple directions, but their efforts lacked coordination without effective leadership. Some groups were moving too quickly and exposing themselves to her remaining accurate fire, while others were being overly cautious and falling behind. The systematic elimination of their officers was having exactly the effect Maria had hoped for. The enemy force was becoming a disorganized mob rather than a disciplined military unit. Her rifle ran dry just as a group of 3 Taliban fighters appeared on a ridge to her left. With no time to reload, Maria drew her pistol and engaged them at a range where most shooters would have struggled to hit anything. 3 precise shots eliminated the immediate threat, but the sound of gunfire had alerted other enemy units to her location. The terrain she had to cross offered little natural cover. She was forced to use every tactical technique she had learned to avoid the increasing volume of fire being directed at her position. Bounding overwatch movements between rock formations, using defilade to mask her approach, and timing her movements to coincide with enemy reload cycles, all became crucial for survival. As she climbed back up the hillside toward her teammates, Maria could see that the American defensive position was under renewed attack. However, the intensity was much less than the coordinated assault that had been building earlier. The enemy forces were clearly confused and disorganized, many of them having been pulled back from assault positions to search for the unknown attacker in their rear area. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson's voice reached her through the radio static as she approached the defensive perimeter. "Gonzalez, what's your status?" "We've been monitoring explosions in the village and enemy activity has decreased significantly." "Still mobile and effective, sir," Maria replied between labored breaths. "Enemy command structure has been neutralized. Their assault capability is severely degraded, but I've got multiple pursuers and I'm almost out of ammunition." The relief in Thompson's voice was evident. "Roger that. We're preparing to provide covering fire for your approach. Head for the eastern side of the perimeter where Morrison has eyes on your route." The SEAL sniper had managed to repair his rifle and was back in action. His first shot eliminated a Taliban fighter who had gotten dangerously close to Maria's position, buying her precious seconds to reach better cover. Walsh, despite his wounded arm, was also engaging targets at shorter ranges with his backup weapon. The final 50 meters to friendly lines became a desperate sprint under intense enemy fire. Bullets kicked up dirt around Maria's feet as she zigzagged between rock formations, using every ounce of speed and agility she possessed. Her teammates provided suppressive fire that forced the pursuing enemy fighters to take cover instead of maintaining aimed fire at her exposed figure. She dove into the American defensive position just as a rocket-propelled grenade exploded against the rocks where she had been seconds earlier. The blast showered her with stone fragments, but she had made it back alive with her mission accomplished. For the first time in hours, Maria allowed herself to believe that they might actually survive this impossible situation. "Report on your actions in the village, Lieutenant Colonel," Thompson ordered as she caught her breath behind the protective rocks. Maria provided a quick tactical summary of the targets she had eliminated and the damage she had inflicted on enemy capabilities. The systematic destruction of their command structure, communications equipment, ammunition supplies, and key weapons had effectively broken the back of the Taliban assault. What had been a coordinated attack by over 200 fighters was now reduced to scattered groups with no clear leadership or unified plan. The immediate tactical situation had improved dramatically, but their strategic position remained precarious. They were still surrounded by hostile forces, still cut off from support and still low on ammunition despite the reduced pressure. The enemy's numerical advantage remained overwhelming, even if their organization had been disrupted. However, the psychological impact of Maria's successful mission extended beyond just the tactical improvements. Her teammates, who had been facing what seemed like certain death just hours earlier, now had renewed confidence in their ability to survive until rescue arrived. The impossible had been accomplished by one determined soldier, proving that even the most desperate situations could be overcome with skill, courage, and aggressive action. Morrison and Walsh, the elite SEAL snipers, looked at Maria with new respect. She had accomplished something that their specialized training and years of experience had not prepared them for. Operating alone behind enemy lines, she had achieved what an entire sniper team had been unable to do under conventional circumstances. "I've never seen anything like that," Morrison admitted as he cleaned his rifle. "Taking on an entire enemy force single-handedly and winning. That's not something they teach in sniper school." Walsh nodded in agreement despite the pain from his wounded arm. "You saved all our lives with that mission. Without functional leadership, those Taliban fighters are just individuals with guns instead of a coordinated military force." The enemy forces were indeed struggling to reorganize themselves after the devastating losses they had sustained. Small groups continued to probe the American defensive position, but their efforts lacked the intensity and coordination of the earlier attacks. Many fighters seemed more concerned with searching for survivors in the burning village than with continuing the assault on the hilltop. As the morning progressed, the tactical situation continued to favor the Americans. Enemy snipers who had been effectively suppressing their defensive positions had been eliminated. The heavy weapons that had posed the greatest threat were destroyed. Most importantly, the command structure that had been coordinating the complex multi-directional assault no longer existed. Maria used the lull in combat to redistribute ammunition among her teammates and help treat the wounded. Rodriguez's shoulder wound was stable but needed proper medical attention. Walsh's arm injury was more serious than he had initially admitted, and he was losing blood at a concerning rate. Both men needed evacuation to a proper medical facility as soon as possible. The radio finally crackled with the news they had been desperately hoping to hear. Air support was becoming available, and a medical evacuation helicopter was being dispatched to their location. The regional situation had stabilized enough that resources could be diverted to extract Alpha Team from their precarious position, but they weren't safe yet. The enemy forces, despite their disorganization, still outnumbered them significantly. If the Taliban fighters could re-establish some form of leadership and coordinate another assault before air support arrived, the situation could still turn desperate again. Maria knew that their survival for the next few hours would depend on maintaining the tactical advantage she had created through her lone assault on the enemy positions. The sound of approaching helicopters came just as the enemy forces were beginning to show signs of reorganization. A new Taliban commander had apparently taken charge of the scattered fighters and was attempting to coordinate one final assault before the Americans could be evacuated. Groups of enemy soldiers were moving back into attack positions, though their efforts lacked the precision and coordination of the earlier assaults. 2 Apache attack helicopters appeared over the ridgeline, their weapon systems immediately engaging the enemy forces scattered throughout the valley. The devastating firepower of the helicopter gunships turned the tactical situation completely in favor of the Americans. Taliban fighters who had been preparing to attack the hilltop position found themselves exposed to precision strikes from above. Maria watched through her binoculars as the Apache helicopters systematically destroyed the remaining enemy capabilities. Vehicle positions were eliminated with Hellfire missiles, while concentrated groups of fighters were engaged with 30mm cannon fire. The psychological impact was immediate. Enemy forces throughout the valley began withdrawing from their positions then faced the overwhelming firepower from the air. The medical evacuation helicopter arrived under escort from the attack aircraft. The landing zone was still under occasional sniper fire, but the pilot skillfully brought his aircraft down while the Yao